All right, we're in Tuesday. I'm calling this The King Sentences Jerusalem, based on the trial that took place yesterday. And as I was suggesting, this judicial opinion, as I'm calling it, has three parts. First of all, the verdict of the king. It's triggered by the question about Jesus' authority. The content of the sentence comes in the parable of the vineyard. We looked at all of that last week. Now we have what I'm calling the kingdom of the king. This is the contrast between the old and the new. Three stories: politics, temporal matters. How does this kingdom that Jesus establishes fit in to the political structures of this world? Are we isolationists, having nothing to do with it whatsoever? Do we fuse the kingdom with the institutions of this world, make them identical, no distinction? Or is there some other way that we think about the connection between the two? Paying taxes to Caesar opens the door to that. What about the eternal question? What's the connection between this kingdom Jesus establishes and the great realities of eternity? We've thought about temporal matters, now eternal matters, and it's triggered by a question from the Sadducees about a guy who dies and 6 more brothers marry the same woman. It's a bizarre, untrue story. It's a reductio ad absurdum type story from the Sadducees, but it opens the door for Jesus to say something vastly more important than simply the answer to the question. And finally, the ethical, the internal question. In this kingdom Jesus is establishing, what's the fundamental ethic? Is it externalism? Is it show? Is it pomp and circumstance? Is it all that kind of display? And of course, what Jesus tells us is it's an inward matter of loving God wholly, unreservedly, and translating that love for God into love for neighbor. This brings us to the last little part of this judicial opinion, the opportunity to repent. Because the one who is standing before them is the Son of David, who is greater than David. David said, "The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet." David's son is greater than David, which in the Jewish point of view is almost incomprehensible. But the one who David is referring to as his son is also his Lord. And that's the same Lord who is saying to these people now that this is their opportunity to embrace and receive Messiah, or refuse to continue to participate in this external, showy religion and pay the consequences for it. So there's kind of the picture in the general context that we're in. And right now it's this well-known incident of a question about taxes. So they sent to him some of the Pharisees and Herodians to catch him in his words. They that did the sending are presumably the ones we were looking at last week. The chief priests, the scribes, the elders. All of these have been sort of rebuffed now by the parable of the vineyard, and so they're sending in some attack squads, hoping to somehow undo Jesus. As we've indicated already, the Pharisees ask the question that's temporal in character, the Sadducees the question that has more eternal significance, the scribes, interestingly, ask the question that has more of an ethical content. Each one is answered by Jesus not based on a citation to authority. He doesn't respond in a rabbinic fashion saying, well, remember what the Talmud says here, or the Midrash says there, or some great tradition of the church or of the Jewish people has said here. Jesus answers independently and intrinsically based on his own authority. It's a remarkable thing. It was very unlike the rabbinic style of the day. And in each case, Jesus doesn't apologize or have to defend his position. He simply speaks as if he had the right to do so. Those who came and confronted him are said to be Pharisees and Herodians. These represent natural enemies, politically and religiously to each other, but they have a common enemy now, Jesus, and so they're willing to join forces in order to try to upset him. The last time in Mark's Gospel we ran into Pharisees and Herodians together was in chapter 3. It's the last time we heard of them together. In that case, Jesus had just healed a man whose hand was withered. And as a result of that, rather than rejoicing in the display of God's power, the Pharisees and Herodians, Mark tells us, went out and began to plot how to destroy this guy. And they've been plotting now for the rest of Mark, you see, and here we are, and they are once again in common cause together coming to Jesus. The Pharisee folks, we've looked at them before. They're kind of the conservatives, you might say, nationalists, not quite as extreme in their nationalism as the zealots who actually advocated armed overthrow, but they would oppose paying taxes. They were for Jewish independence. They were for Israel being its own freestanding state. And so while they weren't prepared to go as far as the zealots and actually put well-placed knives into certain backs, in order to get it done, nevertheless, that was their bias. The Herodians, on the other hand, taking their name from Herod, actually had, at least in some cases, embraced the idea that Herod and his family was the coming Messiah. And so they had rather extravagant estimates of Herod, and they believed that what they should be looking for is a restoration of the family of Herod in Judah. The last king in the family of Herod that had ruled in Judah was named Archelaus. He was sacked by the Romans in 6 AD. From that time on, Judah had been an imperial province and had been under the rule not of kings but of governors called procurators, the most famous of which was Pontius Pilate. These folks were hoping the Herods would be reinstated. They therefore supported payment to Rome because Rome kept Herod propped up and was viewed as an ally of Herod. So you have these two that differ on the question, and they just happen to show up pretending to be having this debate. And here's Jesus, and they're sort of asking now, well, what do you think, esteemed rabbi? And of course they have to butter him up a little bit first. We know you're true, impartial, disinterested, not swept away by people's station, wealth, prestige, influence, etc. You don't care about anybody in that sense. You don't regard a person or their station. You teach the way of, they figure they've got this guy. They give all of this remarkable kind of flattery and then kind of throw in at the end, oh, but we have this one question. Should we pay taxes to Caesar or not? The interesting thing, somewhat ironic, of course, is that everything they say about Jesus is absolutely true, much more than they had ever dreamt. They're saying exactly the truth about Jesus. He was not swept away, impressed by people's station. He could talk to Nicodemus, said to be the teacher in Israel, or he could talk to a Gentile woman who had an issue of blood. He treated each person with the same level of dignity and respect, and had no sense in which he was sort of conned into treating some people favorably and others not so much based on their external circumstances. But these guys don't get that. They think they're just seducing Jesus at this point, and they throw him this little question intended to impale him on the horns of a dilemma. The tax that they refer to as a particular tax, not just taxing in general. In fact, the word that's used here by Mark to describe this tax is actually the Latin word for census, and it referred to a particular tax that was connected to the fact that Judah was at this time an imperial province rather than a kind of quasi-independent kingdom. And in order to stand for the provincial dependence on Rome, they paid what was called a census tax, a sort of poll tax, you might say. It's the very same word that Luke uses when he's giving the birth narrative in his gospel, and he says Augustus sent out a decree that all the world should be taxed. But you'll also hear the word census used there because the word is ambiguous, and you may have noticed that in various translations. That's the word that's being used. After Archelaus had been deposed, this tax had been imposed to sort of symbolize the fact that Rome was really the controlling power in this place. The tax was not a heavy tax. There certainly were other more brutal taxes. The publicans were out collecting in a rapacious way taxes from people, many times who were living in grinding poverty. This was not quite such a big deal. It was 1 denarius. A denarius was a silver coin. It was generally regarded to be about a day's wage for a working guy. You know, go out and work 12, 14 hours in the field, you'd expect to get a denarius. A denarius had, at this time in history, a picture on it of Tiberius Caesar, who is not a good-looking guy. But, you know, I think I would have worked on the image there if I'd been Tiberius. But anyway, there it is. It has an inscription along the edge of it. And, pardon me, I'm going to have to, there we go. Oh, there it is. That's great. And it says, Tiberius Caesar Divi Augusti Filius Augustus, which, by way of translation, is a Tiberius Caesar, divine, august, Filios, son of Augustus. Tiberius, you may know, was the adopted son of his predecessor, Augustus Caesar, was actually his nephew. Augustus Caesar, for all his great accomplishments, never had a son. Not for lack of trying, but it just never happened. And so this was his adopted son and successor. The flip side of this image was a picture of Livia, who was the wife of Augustus, and the inscription, and the mother there, adopted mother of Tiberius, and the inscription there says Pontifex Maximus, which really was the official Roman title for chief in religious matters in Rome. So this coin kind of represented the ultimacy of the Caesar over all of the domains that fell within the world of Rome. And thus, symbolically, it was a little bit offensive to the Jewish people, especially those that were more inclined toward an appreciation for Jewish independence. So they put the question to him, shall we pay or not? Jesus, of course, knowing their hypocrisy, asks them, why do you test me? Bring me a denarius. It's a yes or no question. Always beware of yes or no questions. Jesus doesn't take the bait, but that's what they wanted. Yes or no, up or down, on or off, black or white, which? You just give it. What is it? What is it? Jesus rather responds, as he did last week, to their question with a question. Why do you test me? Certainly not because they had any genuine interest in Jesus' answer. And he knew that. And they knew that. This is the character of hypocrisy. It appears to be one thing when it is something very different. And Jesus had a disarming way of cutting right through hypocrisy, you know? Sometimes we get swept away with it a little bit, but he just sees right through it. Recognizing their interest was not an answer, but just to score an easy point at Jesus' expense. Matthew actually adds the phrase, why do you test me, you play actors? That's the word hypokritos. An actor. It was a Greek word that meant it was originally part of the drama, the stage plays in Greek drama. They kind of took Jesus for a guy from the sticks. He was, after all, from Galilee. Galilee notoriously a little bit backwards, not urbane, not sophisticated, not really as polished as these folks in Jerusalem. They figured he was kind of a country yokel. They could flatter him, seduce him, make short work of him, and still not be late for lunch. I think that's kind of what they thought as they approached him here in the outer court. So Jesus says, well, bring me a denarius, or show me one. It's ironic, of course, they just happen to have a couple in their pocket. Jesus didn't have any at his disposal, but they provide one to him, and he asks the question, whose image and inscription is this? Now, it'd be interesting to know just what the tone of voice was. You know, sometimes if you have a pet, you put a dog tag on them, you know, so that if they get lost, somebody, oh look, there's a tag. Oh, there's a phone number. We know who owns this. You can call them up and, you know, happily reunite owner with pet. And that's probably, I think, the way Jesus looks at it and goes, well, look at that. Now, whose name is that anyway? Wow, whose picture is that? Now, these guys don't realize he's the one baiting the trap, you see? They think, what, don't you know Caesar when you see him? He's the biggest guy in the world. And so they say, kind of incredulous, "Well, it's Caesar. Come on, man, get with it." And Jesus says, "Well, okay, fine. You better give it back to him. It's got his name on it. There's his phone number. Give him a call. It's his." You know. Give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. And then this powerful qualifier, and to God the things that are God's. That, I think you know, is one of the most profound, trenchant, elegant statements that's ever been uttered in the history of the world. People that have never read the Bible have heard this phrase, haven't they? Render to Caesar. It's not something that's restricted to religious types like maybe most of us in this room, but everybody's heard it. Jesus gives, therefore, an answer. The answer is pay the tax. So he does respond to the yes or no question with a yes, you should pay it. But then, of course, he qualifies it with what's called the principle of jurisdiction. The Latin word juris, law, diction, to speak, refers to the capacity, the authority to speak law, to establish rules. It was commonly understood in the ancient world at the time that Jesus made this statement that somebody in the world had the right and authority to speak the law for everybody, and to bind not only matters of external behavior, but actually inward conscience. That's why the Caesar claimed the right to be worshipped. He didn't want simply your obedience, he wanted your conscience. And when Jesus said this, therefore, even though we sort of take it for granted, it was one of the most remarkable reversals of a commonly accepted philosophy that had ever been spoken by anybody, any philosopher or anybody else. Because Jesus here affirms limited but repudiates absolute civil authority. He acknowledges there is such a thing as jurisdiction. Civil authority indeed does have the right to speak the law, but within limits, and those limits are delineated by conscience and duties owed to God. That's the fundamental principle. If I had way more time and a lot more leisure, it'd be interesting just to trace the history of that statement down through Western civilization. But to give you a very short Reader's Digest version, it wasn't until the Protestant Reformation that this concept was really worked out in any kind of detail. Up until then, the notion of a divine right of kings was pretty much taken for granted. And it was understood that if you were the king, you were the law. Rex lex. King equals law. You could, by definition, not do anything wrong. Because if you did it, it was right because you did it. That kind of circular absolutism. And we had plenty of examples of that down through history until the Reformation. Martin Luther at least implied it in his broadside criticism of the princes in Germany and their abuses, but he never works out what you'd call a truly elegant political theory, but Calvin does. And this is one of the great innovations that we trace back to John Calvin, who in a kind of microscopic level in Geneva worked out what we would call a notion of jurisdiction, limited government, division of labor, checks and balances. He was the one that more or less invented that, though he didn't implement it. It was implemented by the city council at his suggestion. And that became the kind of the trial of such an approach. John Knox, the founder of the Presbyterian Church, was a disciple of Calvin, visited Geneva, was blown away by what he saw. He was from Scotland. Absolute monarchy had been the order of the day in Scotland, but he took that idea back, and in an extended context with Mary, Queen of Scots, of course, was able to bring about in Scotland what was regarded generally as a Presbyterian, not form of church, they did that, but a Presbyterial form of government, checks and balances, division of labor. That work of genius by Knox, though it never was implemented thoroughly, it was certainly a good college try there, trickled down into England. and became the basis philosophically for what's called the Puritan Revolution, 1640 to 1660. It was out of that we got the Westminster Confession of Faith, but we also got the Puritan experiment in England of a division of labor, a kind of republican or presbyterial form of government. It didn't work. The English weren't ready for it. We had the reinstatement, the restoration of the monarchy, 1660, Charles II. But some of those Puritans crossed the pond and said, let's try it again. Let's establish a new England. And let's put in place some of those Calvinistic ideas of limited government, jurisdiction, checks and balances. And as you're well aware, that simmered among the Puritans, basically spread throughout all of the colonies, so that by the time the father of the American Constitution, James Madison, was writing most of the Federalist Papers, along with Hamilton and John Jay, this became the order of the day. This became one of the fundamental principles that was advocated in New York to get them to buy off on ratifying the U.S. Constitution, namely limited government. No absolute monarch. Nobody who speaks for God and intrudes on both matters of external political life and also inward religious conscientious life. Federalist 10 especially, of course, is profoundly insightful on this point, but much of what he wrote presupposes that all the way through. Statists represent the general trajectory of government that it always wants to become more powerful. Statists follow the bias that human government always wants more, not less. We've elected plenty of presidents in the United States who've argued for less government. We've never gotten it. We always get more because that's the bias of government. It's an irresistible impulse and trajectory of government to take more, not less. And even in our country, we've had to wrestle with that. Frederick William I of Prussia said, "Salvation of God, everything else is my affair." That has been the heartbeat of many monarchs and many governments down through history. At the time of the Second World War, of course, the run-up to it in Germany, the Nazis were increasingly encroaching on the province of the life of faith. They were wanting loyalty oaths, that sort of thing. And when Hitler became the chancellor in 1933, that just ramped up the demands. Most of the Christians in Germany capitulated. The Roman Catholics reached an accord with Hitler. I don't say that to be critical of the Catholics because most of the Protestants did too. By and large, across the board, the Christian presence in Germany caved in and allowed an intrusion of government exceeding its boundaries to invade the province of life. But there was in Germany a small group of courageous Christian leaders who bounded together with like-minded Christians and formed what was called the Confessing Church. These were people like Karl Barth, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Martin Niemöller, and others, names you might recognize, and they courageously stood up against this growing, intruding governmental authority. They got together in a city called Barmen and produced what's called the Barmen Confession. In it, there was a broadside rejection of the Nazi vision of a totalitarian state that took everything, including conscience, from the people under their regime. It objected to a state as though it said, quote, "The state over and beyond the special commission should and could become the single totalitarian order of human life, thus fulfilling the church's vocation as well." Karl Barth signed personally a copy of the Barmen Confession and sent it personally to Adolf Hitler in the late 30s. Not a good career expanding move, you know. Barth was not German, however. He was Swiss. He had been an heir of that Calvinist mentality, and he was full of that kind of view of things. And we're happy that he actually was able to return to Switzerland and taught at Basel in Switzerland, which remained, of course, independent during the Second World War. Here in the United States, we have celebrated this idea that there is a sacred place of conscience and government has no right tramping in there. During that same time period, the Second World War and the run-up to it, there was a character here in the United States whose name was Barnett. He happened to be a Jehovah's Witness. Now, you know that it's not too often that I rise up in a holy defense of the Jehovah's Witnesses. You realize that. But nevertheless, here was a man, just about the time the war was getting started, and there was a furor of patriotism sweeping across this country, of course, as you can imagine. Here was a man, a Jehovah's Witness, who refused to salute the flag. He was charged because at that point it was required that you do this. Government requiring that this man salute the flag. Now, at this point, you have to make a distinction, of course, because while I would deeply disagree generally with Jehovah's Witnesses, and I would deeply disagree even with the practice of this man, at the same time, it has to be recognized that for coercive power to be brought against someone who has a conscientious conviction, as wrong as it might be, for government to bring coercive power is to overstep those bounds. I've had plenty of conversations with Jehovah's Witnesses in which I've tried to persuade them of the error of their ways. I've never pulled out a gun. I've never pulled out a baseball bat. I don't think that's a productive way of persuading someone. But government, you see, has all of those buttons it can push, and it becomes very tempting to require that folks do something at the point of conscience, which is in fact a violation of the rule Jesus announced. And it applies not just to us Presbyterians, but it even applies to a Jehovah's Witness. So while I differ deeply with their view of things, including the flag salute issues, at the same time, you see something else was going on. That's why this famous case, every law school student reads it in constitutional law, or they should, and the most famous quote from it, State of Board of Education versus Barnett, if there's any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion, or force citizens to confess by word or act their faith therein. That has been the bulwark, one of the central notions in American constitutional theory. I only want to mention to you, and I think you most of you know, that in the last 20 years or so, that principle has been under a ferocious assault in these good old United States of America. We Christians should be vigilant, not just in being aware of it, but being a little bit activist about it. Martin Niemöller famously said, with respect to the Nazis, first they came for the socialists. I didn't speak out because I wasn't a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists. I didn't speak out because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews. I didn't speak out because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for me. There was no one left to speak for me. And that's a sorry commentary, isn't it, on a Christian movement that was too quiet. I don't know, if Niemöller were living in America, what would he say? First they came for the Jehovah's Witnesses. I wasn't a Jehovah's Witness. Then they came for the florists. Oh, I didn't care about them. Then they came for the football players. Well, you can go where you want with this, but you know, you get the point. We Christians need to be on the ball. We are the ones who, more than anyone else, own the great truth of limited government and jurisdiction. I don't think the quote we just saw from that case, Barnett, could ever have happened if Jesus had not said one day in open court in the temple, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, but to God what is God's." So let's be grateful that we have him as our standard. Well, they marveled at him. The Greek word is Thalmadzon. Thalmadzon means to marvel. Exathalmadzon means to marvel just over the top. They were they were blown away. They had nothing that they could say in response. Psalm 9 says, "The wicked is snared in the work of his own hands." One commentator said Jesus trapped his enemies while elevating the discussion far above the petty jealousies of those who came to him. Tertullian, of course, recognized, as most Christian commentators have, this little interesting aspect. The denarius had an image of Caesar. We have an image of God. Tertullian in the 2nd century, about the year 180, said, quote, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." That is, give to Caesar his image stamped upon his coin, give to God his own image stamped upon you, so that while you render to Caesar the coin that is his due, you may render to your own self to God. Okay, we're going to tuck in one more story. This will have to go by quickly, but this is the Sadducees and the whole question about this marriage deal. Some Sadducees who say there is no resurrection came to him and asked him a question, saying, "Teacher, Moses wrote that if a man's brother dies, leaving a wife and no child, the man shall marry the widow and raise up children for his brothers." Well, there were 7 brothers. The first married, and when he died, left no children. The second married the widow and died, leaving no children. The third likewise. None of the 7 left the children. Do y'all remember the song in the late 60s, "I'm Henry VIII, I am"? I always think of that song when I read this story, you know. Last of all, the woman herself died. In the resurrection, whose wife will she be? For they all 7 married. Well, Jesus responds to them. This is, there's no subtlety in this. Is this not the reason you are wrong? That you know neither the Scriptures nor the power of God? For when they rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. And as for the dead being raised, haven't you read in the book of Moses the story about the bush, how God said to him, "I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob." He's not the God of the dead, but of the living. You are so wrong. And that's Jesus' one conversation with the Sadducees. Well, the Sadducees say there is no resurrection. They were the ancient naturalists. There's only life here. This is the only time Jesus talks exclusively to the Sadducees. This is a group that originated around the time of the Maccabean revolt, about 165 thereabouts BC, along with the Pharisees, who were more conservative, and the Essenes, who were separatists. So it's like you've got the liberals, you've got the conservatives, and you've got the Amish. You know, the Essenes were out there in their own little community and didn't really interact much with everybody else. The Sadducee, the word derives from the Hebrew word zedek, which means righteous. My time is running a little short, so I'm going to just race through this quickly just to give you a quick sense of the difference. Pharisees affirmed an active, present, sovereign God. Sadducees, God is distant. It's more of a deist vision of God. And human free will is the emphasis you'll find among them. Pharisees affirmed angels and demons. Sadducees denied it. Pharisees affirm that God is speaking. We have a talkative God. He speaks in the Torah. He speaks through the prophets. He speaks through the histories. He speaks through the Talmud. He speaks through all of these various sources. They're very lavish in seeing God speaking in many places. The Sadducees, much more restrictive. He only speaks in the Torah, and that's it. That's the only scriptures they recognized. The Pharisees affirmed resurrection. The Sadducees denied it. The Pharisees were what we call Torah-centric, that is, word-centric. Ever since the post-exilic period, there had been 2 kind of flavors of Judaism: temple-centric, Torah-centric. The Sadducees were more temple-centric, and part of the reason is because they made such great money off the operation of the temple, as we noted a week or 2 ago. The Sadducees were a very tiny minority that were extraordinarily wealthy. They were tied to the temple, the priesthood, the upper class. They were urbane, they were well-to-do, they were sophisticated. Josephus didn't have much good to say about them. He said, quote, "The Sadducees are those that compose the second order after the Pharisees and take away fate entirely. and suppose that God is not concerned in our doing or not doing what is evil. And they say that to act what is good or what is evil is at a man's own choice. They sound a little bit like postmoderns to me. I think there's a few Sadducees running around loose today. And that the one or the other belongs so to everyone, that they may act as they please. They also take away the belief of the immortal duration of the soul and the punishments and rewards in Hades. They were not well respected in the Jewish world. They believed that at death your life just evaporates entirely. There's no continuing existence. The general belief at the time among Jewish people was very different. They did believe in resurrection. When Jesus was chatting with Martha at the tomb of her brother Lazarus, Martha said, "I know he will rise again at the resurrection at the last day." She's repeating something she learned in Sunday school, you see, synagogue school. She's repeating something that was commonly viewed among the vast majority of Jewish people, except the Sadducees. So they were in quite a minority. The Midrash says, "Whoever denies the resurrection of the dead has no share in the world to come." All right, so there you've got the kind of lay of the land. The Sadducees remind Jesus that Moses had said in that patriarchal setting that if a woman has a husband who dies and there's no male heirs to the husband's name, that a brother should marry her and that the sons that are born will be named for the deceased brother. And that may seem like a strange rule to us, but in that culture at that time, somehow it made sense. So that was the context for the question, and then they pose the story that they give us here. The Sadducees are raising an issue that, frankly, for Mark's audience in Rome 40 years later was not a big burning issue. I mean, they weren't overly concerned about that particular point. And in fact, the Sadducees really ceased to exist after the fall of Jerusalem, as Jesus predicted in 70 AD. The Pharisees owned Judaism from that point on. So this is kind of a little side issue here, not carrying a whole lot of freight in itself. But Jesus takes the question and elevates it also to a much larger level, just as the render to Caesar question gives us a much broader vision of things. So in the same way, something like that happens here. Jesus initially sides with the Pharisees. He believes in resurrection, as did Paul. You remember when he was before the Sanhedrin? Luke tells us, Acts 23, when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees, the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, this is Paul, "Men and brother, I'm a Pharisee." You see. Here's Paul the apostle, but if he's got to choose teams, he'll choose to be a Pharisee. And Jesus would be more closely aligned with the Pharisees, but with some significant caveats thrown in. Jesus parts company initially with the Sadducees, but even at a more profound level with the Pharisees, because he gives us a principle that eternity is a transformation, not merely an extension of life as we know it. That there is a new reality, not simply a projection of the present reality. The Pharisees would have seen heaven as just kind of a continuation of earth, but better, you know. Jesus sees it very differently, a difference of quality, not merely a quantity of existence. The Pharisees were not far from a Platonic view, the immortality of the soul, as you know that Plato argues in the Phaedo dialogue and elsewhere. Jesus he's not just an immortality of the soul guy. Jesus isn't just a Platonist here. There's something else going on. I won't recite all this again. You get the general drift of the story. 7 brothers. This story was not invented for this occasion. It had been around a long time. This was like the calling card of the Sadducees. This was one of the arguments they liked to use. It was a reductio ad absurdum. How could one woman who had 7 husbands be married? You know, which one is she going to be married to? And there's no good answer to it. And so it's like their way of proving that there can't be any resurrection. So that was the general drift of the story. It was first found in the apocryphal book of Tobit, which is rollicking fun to read. So if you ever have a chance to read Tobit, you'll come across it there. The question that Jesus is confronted with, whose wife will she be? It's assuming that the coming world is just an extension of the present world, which was the Pharisee view. So the argument worked, got a little traction with the Pharisees, Not so much with Jesus. Jesus rather bluntly says, aren't you therefore mistaken that you don't know the Scriptures and you don't know the power of God? Later on, he's going to say, are you not greatly mistaken? One commentator said it's something like telling a Wall Street banker he knows nothing about finance. You know, this is how Jesus responds to them. You don't know the Scriptures. I'm going to skip by these, but these are texts from the Old Testament which at least strongly suggest resurrection. They're not scriptures the Sadducees recognize, but you certainly find it. Job, I know that my Redeemer lives. Isaiah, your dead shall live. Together with my dead body they shall arise. Daniel, and many of those who sleep in the dust of death shall awake. And other texts. It's not a full-blown, robust, well-developed idea in the Old Testament. It's really the New Testament that gives us this wonderful kind of courageous exclamation of praise. Death, where's your sting? Grave, where's your victory? You know, that's the New Testament. But the Old Testament certainly hints at it in no uncertain terms. So Jesus, first of all, gives them a bad time because they're just not recognizing the full-orbed expression of God's truth on this subject. But even more importantly, they're not recognizing the power of God. This whole question of, how are bodies going to be raised from the dead, and what if you've been cremated, and what's going to happen there? All of this, come on. What God are we dealing with here? He's not crippled. This is the power of God is not limited by these incidental things that may or may not happen in our human experience. Jesus says, when they rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage. They're like angels in heaven. This parts deeply from the Pharisee point of view. So Jesus, once again, on all these points, he comes from a fresh, unexpected perspective. He's not simply reciting standard, accepted Jewish tradition. He comes as if he knows something most of us don't know. And he gives us insights that we wouldn't know except that he told us. And in this, we have a great case in point. This situation of resurrection is not simply a continuation of our earthly experience, although I have to say it hurts me a little bit to say that because I can't stand the thought of not being married to my wife in eternity, but we've got a pact. We're just going to hang out together anyway, so that's the deal. But the point is, resurrection life is not just prolonged earthly life, it's an entirely different order, having no need for the institution of marriage. This has been Christian teaching ever since Jesus said it. Augustine said, marriages are on account of children, children on account of succession, succession on account of death. But in heaven there is no death, neither is there marriage. That's been the standard Christian view, that we have a wonderful and glorious experience that is virtually indescribable to us now. It won't involve marriage, but it'll be great, and thus we have much to look forward to. I love Jim Edwards' quote on this. I'm just going to steal it wholesale and throw it in here. The glorious realities of the life to come can no more be accommodated to our pedestrian routines of earthly life than can butterflies be compared to caterpillars. Present earthly experience is entirely insufficient to forecast divine heavenly realities. We can no more imagine heavenly existence than an infant in utero can imagine a Beethoven piano concerto or the Grand Canyon at sunset. And it may be that the difference is even more staggering than that. And so the Bible is very oblique about this. We're just told it's going to be good. We should be relishing the prospect. Jesus says they are like angels. The Sadducees, of course, denied angels as well. But one little footnote, Jesus doesn't say we become angels. You hear people say that. I know you're too smart, too sophisticated, to have misunderstood. We don't go to heaven to become angels. We are human beings. We will be human beings forever. Perfected, glorious human beings, as Jesus himself is eternally vera homo, vera deus, truly man, truly God. So we share in that. We don't become angels, but we become like angels insofar as angels don't marry and we won't marry. That's the point where the similarity is ended. Then Jesus pushes even deeper. But concerning the dead that they rise, haven't you read in the book of Moses in the bush passage how God spoke to him saying, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. This "have you not read" is a standard rabbinic opening to a teaching point. It's like, is it not written, or let's be instructed by, so it's not insulting as it may strike us. But he does correct the Sadducees here a little bit as if they were school children. He refers now not to these other sources that they wouldn't recognize anyway, Job, Psalms, Daniel. He refers to Moses, the Pentateuch, the Torah, which they do recognize. And within that, he goes to the most central and well-accepted text in the Torah, the burning bush passage, probably the one that was the most famous and the one that was the most well-accepted, and points out that in that context, God says, "I am the God of Abraham." And of course, that immediately tells the whole story. He's the living God, and He's the God of the living, and thus there is a sense in which this whole notion of a persisting existence and resurrection and so on is kind of packaged into that. So Jesus refutes annihilation, believed by some, and by implication here, based on this text, affirms resurrection, saying God is not the God of the dead, but of the living, therefore you are greatly mistaken. I love the Greek here. Humes, you, polou, greatly, huge, planosthei, like a planet wanders, you greatly wander. You are so far out there, we can't even see you from here. You know, that's how far you are so wrong. Of course, the greatest argument against the Sadducees would come at the empty tomb. All right, Sunday school lesson. No surprise, point one, to state the obvious, render to Caesar what is Caesar's. The Christian movement at its best down through history has been characterized by Christian people that knock themselves out to be good citizens. They draw a line at conscience, but otherwise they pay their taxes, drive the speed limit, and do whatever they can to be respectful and thoughtful toward those whom God has placed in authority over us. One of many texts that stands for that proposition, Romans 13, therefore you must be subject, not only because of wrath, that is the coercive power of earth, but also for conscience sake, the sacred authority of heaven. For because of this you pay taxes, for they are God's minister, attending continually to this very thing. Render therefore to all their due, taxes to whom taxes are due, customs to whom customs, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. 2, render to God what is God's. There is a sacred line where no government or any other coercive power has a right to intrude. And Christians are authorized to stand at that line and defend it, and not be drugged into doing something that violates our fidelity to our God. Of course, Peter and John are a great example of that when they stood before some of these same people who were now testing Jesus and said, they called them and commanded them not to speak at all or to teach in the name of Jesus. Peter and John answered and said to them, whether it's right in the sight of God to listen to you more than to God, you judge. But we cannot but speak the things which we have seen and heard. 2 things to render, 1 thing to remember. And that is, I say this with all due respect, we are just little caterpillars. Some of us are pretty good-looking caterpillars, I grant that, but in the great scheme of things, we are caterpillars anticipating a glorious destiny exceeding anything that we could ask or imagine. If you try to explain to a little caterpillar living inside a cocoon that someday the whole universe of that creature is just, this tiny little space, that someday it's going to be a butterfly coursing through a lovely setting. How would you explain that? How would you convey that? The Apostle John says, behold, what manner of the love the Father has bestowed on us, that we should be called children of God. Therefore the world does not know us, because it does not know Him. Beloved, now we're the children of God. It has not yet been revealed what we shall be. But we know that when He is revealed, we shall be like Him, for we shall see Him as He is, and everyone who has this hope in Him purifies himself as we lean into that great destiny, just as He is pure.
you.